I am extremely pleased then to introduce our two presenters today. Firstly, Lisa Schimanski is the CEO of Volunteering Tasmania. Lisa started as the CEO in October last year, and then by January, as a result of the bushfires in Tasmania in that month, Volunteering Tasmania was asked by Huon Valley Council to assist it to coordinate spontaneous volunteers. And that was the first time that Volunteering Tasmania had activated that function that it had set up for of assisting organisations with spontaneous volunteers. And so Lisa's going to tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for Volunteering Tasmania. And then our second presenter is Andrew McCullough. He is the Manager for Volunteer Experience at New South Wales SES. He's responsible for rolling out New South Wales SES's Volunteering Reimagined initiative, which I would consider to be a leading initiative for the sector in redesigning and in expanding emergency service volunteering. And spontaneous volunteering is a part of that initiative. So in December last year, Andrew's team coordinated spontaneous volunteers to assist SES units in responding to the Sydney Hailstorm event that happened in December. And Andrew's going to share some learnings from that experience today. So what's interesting for us for this webinar is that while Lisa and Andrew come from two very different kinds of organisations, for both Volunteering Tasmania and for New South Wales SES, coordinating spontaneous volunteers on the ground is a fairly new experience. And so both those organisations have learned a huge amount from those two recent experiences. And Lisa and Andrew have both been very generous in agreeing to share some of that learning with us today. So we're very lucky to have them here. So Lisa is going to speak first. So Lisa, if you want to get your mic up and going while I get your slides up. I'll just give Lisa a moment to get the microphone going.
Hello, can you hear me there?
Yep, that's coming on. Could be a little bit louder, I think.
You want me to
Yeah,
go louder?
that's great.
How's that?
That's good. I would just put the poll up again, and so people can tell you themselves how well they can hear you.
Shall I do testing?
Yes, absolutely. You have to do that. It's looking good. So we have one excellent volume. That's great to know. One person's having trouble with sound, so I'll go and attend to helping them out while you present, Lisa. So thank you very much. I'll hand the floor over to you. Lisa's just going to give us a little brief introduction to the experience with Huon Valley for about 10 minutes. Thanks, Lisa.
Great, thank you. So, well, thank you all for joining us. This is my first webinar presenting, so I will try to do that as a disembodied voice, but bear with me. Volunteering Tasmania is the peak body for volunteering. There's volunteering peaks, as many of you would know, in all of the states, and Volunteering Australia is our national peak. We're member-based organisations, and we work with both volunteer organisations, so organisations that use volunteers, but also we support volunteers themselves. And for both parties, what we like to do is ensure that everyone understands both their rights and their responsibilities as they embark in volunteering. And today, at Blythe's invitation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the experience that we had in Huonville. So I'll see if I can change slides here. Look at that. And I will refer to, first of all, EV Crew, which is our formal emergency volunteering. It's called the Emergency Volunteering Community Response to Extreme Weather. And this program came out of Volunteering Queensland, who unfortunately have to have a very mature approach to working in extreme weather events because of the number of extreme weather events that they get. So we have modelled what the Queensland guys have done up there, and we actually have a database. Now, prior to the Huonville fires, or I'll call them the Tasmanian fires, we had about 800 Tasmanians on that database from all over the state. And the idea behind the database in Tasmania, which has been set up since 2014, was that we would be able to have a number of people available to actually assist in emergency events if they were required. Now, I'll go into a little bit more detail about how that actually worked in Huonville. The other part of we have a contract with the state government, and the other part of that contract is that Volunteering Tasmania would actually support the coordination of spontaneous volunteers in emergency events. And that's actually the major part of what we did in January. So, for those of you who have worked in this space, you will know what a spontaneous volunteer is, but I thought it would be interesting or important to actually describe it because my first experience, as Blythe said, was in January. And the idea behind the definition of a spontaneous volunteer is that they seek to contribute their assistance during or after an event and are unaffiliated with any existing official emergency management response and recovery. And that unaffiliated piece is the important bit. And oftentimes what we use spontaneous volunteers for is that surge capacity. And that's certainly what we found in the Tasmanian case. So just to give you an idea of what happened in January. So over the Christmas break, everything went swimmingly and we all had a lovely break, and then in mid-January, all hell broke loose in Tasmania. We had fires across a wide number of areas in the state, right up north through the Central Highlands, which was an incredibly difficult area to access for our emergency services. And we've got an amazing amount of natural heritage and world heritage areas up there that needed protecting. And then it started to encroach on residential areas down through Huonville, out at Bothwell and Queenstown, and these are in very different areas of the state. So what we did was actually contacted the 5 local government areas that were impacted, and we got a call from the Huon Valley Council and they were overwhelmed. They'd just opened an evacuation centre. It looked like the entire southern area of Tasmania was under threat. That was around probably, I'm guessing, about 5,000 people. And there's really only one road out over the Huon River. So the evacuation centre was set up in Huonville, and they were getting overwhelmed by people wanting to either provide their own time in volunteering or donations. So we said, look, fine, absolutely happy to help. We'll set up a call centre here in Hobart, just don't divert your phones. And they went, no, we've only got one line in and out of the PCYC. It's for everything, we can't divert the phones. So it was a Friday night and myself and the Deputy CEO of Volunteering Tas said, well, there's only one thing for it, and went down there and placed ourselves in the actual centre and stayed there for the next week. So the roles that we played as Volunteering Tasmania over that week were we provided personnel for the front desk to welcome people in. We set up the systems for volunteering. We provided support for rostering the roles for volunteering in the evacuation centre. So that was about 10 to 15 volunteers per shift, and there were 3 shifts a day. Now, what was really interesting about this whole aspect of it is that we were overwhelmed by by volunteers, and we did not run out of offers of assistance. So we also set up registration forms, and there is a question later about working with vulnerable people checks. We had stat decks to support us in making sure that we had done the checks required. And we had formal sign-in and sign-out, did some PDs and task shifts, looked at inductions, safety, and safety requirements for the volunteers. The types of roles that the volunteers played in the centre these were for the Huon Valley Council and the logistics of the centre. So they manned the front desk. We ended up being able to have volunteers on the front desk. They assisted with the operations and logistics of the centre. We had runners for comms. We had concierge for to welcome people in. We had at one stage over 100 dogs and cats in the centre with the people that were there. So they had to be taken into a separate area and looked after. So we had people doing that. We had personal support, and then we had people on night duty. What I should say is that we worked on the logistics, and then there was a whole range of services that were in the evacuation centre. So the Salvation Army did the food, Red Cross did registrations. We had Council of Churches who did a lot of the personal support, and St John's Ambulance were there, and there was also Save the Children to provide entertainment and support for the children and families. So once we'd done all that, one of the key roles that Volunteering Tas also played was to work with the government on the comms that went out publicly. So although we were really grateful for the number of people that were offering assistance, it was really easy to get overwhelmed, and because it went on for a 3-week period, people were coming down to the centre and turning up and wanting to provide support. So across all of our channels, social media, as well as into mainstream media, we actually did an enormous communications campaign to drive people to the EV Crew database and website instead of coming down into the centre itself. Now, it was an amazing experience. It showed us so much around the value of volunteers in this space. And the reality is that our response agencies do require surge capacity. We had a situation where we just could not have had that centre open for the number of people that we had unless we had those spontaneous volunteers. And if I give you an idea of that, over the long weekend, we had up to 700 people on site. We had 300 or so sleeping in the centre and another 400 or so out in camper vans and cars outside the centre. And as I said, that was also with associated domestic animals. There was another site set up for livestock, and anyone who had livestock went and stayed out at the Ranelagh Showgrounds with another set of local council staff and volunteers, and there was about 100 people at its peak there. This emergency actually went on. People were out of their homes for up to 3 weeks, and it kept ebbing and flowing as to when people had to be in the centre and out of the centre, depending on what the fire warnings were saying. So it was a long, drawn-out process. We had lots of very tired volunteers, very tired staff, but everyone did an amazing job. The biggest lesson that we learned was that local knowledge, skills and experience and connections are amazing to provide the improvisation and the innovation that's required in these sorts of emergency events. And if they are harnessed, they are invaluable. And I only realised this afternoon, I'm about to quote Blythe in what she says, but I cannot tell you how true we found this, in that spontaneous volunteers are there well after everyone else has gone. So this quote is, despite the highly specialised and capable emergency management systems, members of the public are usually the first on the scene in an emergency or disaster and remain long after the official services have ceased. Citizens may play vital roles in helping those affected to respond and recover, and can provide invaluable assistance to official agencies. Now, one example of the difference that it made both to the community and to this organisation was the Huonville Football Club. They, on the first day, I'm going to wrap up very soon because I've just gone a bit over time, I realise. The Huonville Football Club on Friday, the president, this was when the fires really hit in Huonville, the president, Todd, rang Wombat, the guy at the local council, gave him his number and said, listen, mate, we're here if you need us. Give me a call. On the Sunday, I called Todd and said, we've just got no one who's able to do overnight shifts for us. Could you rally the forces? Anyway, Todd and the Huonville Football Club provided 3 to 5 volunteers every single day for that event. Overnight, so either from 7 p.m. to 12 a.m. or through 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Some of the guys and their partners missed work and got themselves sort of on different shifts. Others would come straight from work and do a shift for us. When I spoke to Todd afterwards, he said it's made us really value our community, and it's made the community realise that we're not just a bunch of blokes who kick a football around on a Saturday. So it was a really moving experience to watch the difference that makes in a community. Now, I've quickly got a slide here on the formal way that this works, and I'm just going to quickly say to you that we did not actually use the EV Crew database. What was really interesting was that the Huonville Council quite rightly said to us, we want to use our locals, can you just roster on our locals? We don't want to kick into the database. And when you look at the theory behind this, which is what I've just pulled up, EV Crew and a formalised spontaneous volunteer strategy sits right at the top of that list. Really what it happens in local communities is that they come together either, first of all, in a very informal way, and then they come together in a more structured way, which is what we had at the PCYC. So where to from here? We just want to be able to enhance the response of spontaneous volunteers and partner with councils to build their capacity to know how to use those spontaneous volunteers, and for us to also provide on-the-ground support if they require it, and also to work in much closer with other community service organisations to provide greater interoperability between different types of volunteers. So I'm going to finish up there, Blythe, and open up for Andrew to kick in.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll pass over to Andrew. So Andrew, if you want to get your mic up and working, Andrew will give us an overview of a quite different example, and before we throw to questions. And I'm already getting messages, Lisa, to say how interesting that example and that experience is, people. So that's great. All right, Andrew, have you got your mic up and going yet?
Yeah, thanks, Blythe. Can everyone hear me all right?
Let me pop up the little poll and they can tell you themselves. You might have to say something. People can
Everyone can hear me, just testing. Yep, sounds good.
Great, I'll pass over to you. You've got the floor now, Andrew.
Okay, thanks everyone. So today I'm just going to cover off on a recent event for us. In the December holidays, this was just before Christmas time, we had a major storm that passed through Sydney. And this is on the back of another storm that passed through just weeks earlier. We had hailstorms, about 8 centimetres in diameter. And in Berowra, a small community just to the north of Sydney before the Hawkesbury River, for those not from Sydney, about 1,470 jobs in the town. So I'm just going to try to get the next slide here. There we go. Almost every property in that community was affected, and it all happened very quickly one evening. And we sent a lot of different resources to that community, SES teams from across New South Wales. And we had fire and rescue, rural fire service. We even had teams from Broken Hill and Lightning Ridge come and assist. But the work continued, and we wanted to get everything wrapped up for Christmas time. We had a number of people drop in and offer their assistance from the local community. So local people who just wanted to help. And just echoing Lisa's comments as well about using local skills, knowledge and experience, this was a real benefit for us of using these local people. So we could bring in more of our SES volunteers from around the state, but this was work that really local people wanted to do and could safely do it. We had a central location at the Warina Street Oval in the centre of Berowra, which we used as a staging area, and we started off with sandbagging, but they also did a lot of other tasks as well, coordinating a lot of it through the Berowra Community Facebook group, which I'll cover off shortly. One of the things about this particular example as well is that it wasn't just a surge in workforce to get more boots on the ground. This was really about using local people, and part of it was about mitigating that community, I guess, unhappiness that you sometimes get after these major events, especially during the lead up to Christmas time, when it can get very busy and everyone's rushing around wanting to get their jobs done as quickly as possible. This was really about mitigating that, or ensuring against negative community sentiment and offering people an opportunity to get involved. Within our internet management team, this was under our public information section as part of the community liaison function. So we worked directly with our operations officer on the ground in Berowra to find suitable jobs for these people to do. This might be something that's becoming more and more popular, but the use of social media for spontaneous volunteering was really good. And you can see I've copied a Facebook post there from Lynn, who's also online here today, along with a couple of others who helped, including Katie Moulton, on the day in Berowra. So we used the local group in Facebook, the local community group on Facebook in Berowra to ask for help. And it was a really great way of getting local people to come in, and just local people, not getting people all across Sydney to come and help. We also had a very visible location at the Oval in the centre of town, so people would drive past and want to get involved based on what they saw. And they saw people having a very positive volunteer experience and wanted to get involved because of that. We estimate, or the guys on the ground estimate, that we saved about 3 days of operational time by utilising spontaneous volunteers for this event. So I think people as well saw it as an opportunity to reduce the time and the impact on the community by getting involved, which is great. I'll go through just briefly now some of the different stages of the onboarding and then how we utilise spontaneous volunteers, just so you get an idea of some of the background. When they first turned up, we had a tent or a marquee set up right next to the sand dump. You can see on the screen there. Big sign saying volunteer today. We then asked volunteers to enter the details into a paper form. We also have an iPad app which will then print a label with their photo on it. You can see that there with a QR code. They signed a health declaration which we used the government solicitor to write up to make sure it was all above board. And that made sure that they were signing to say they had no health injuries that would impact their ability to volunteer today. We also asked them to sign a media declaration that they would be okay to release their images, or we could release their images for publicity purposes later. At the time they were being registered, we captured a bit of a view of them. Are they going to be fit to do the task? And then we considered what job might be suitable and appropriate for them to do. We issued them with a high-vis vest in most cases, or a hat, gloves if they wanted them, water, whatever resource they required. And noting that part of Blythe's research talks about individualism in volunteering, so not just about making a whole heap of clones, but they're giving the people opportunity to help themselves and making their own experience out of this. So we're looking at other options now, rather than just fitting out everyone with the same hat and the same vest, but how do we give someone something a bit different, where they can really feel like they're part of a team, but also have some sort of individualism about themselves, so they feel like they've still got their own identity to them when they're volunteering. When we actually utilised the spontaneous volunteers, they got involved in a range of different tasks. So not just sandbagging, but door knocking as well. We cooked a giant barbecue for all the fireys and SES volunteers on the ground, which they contributed to, and cooked about 20 spontaneous volunteers cooked the barbecue for several hours. They actually went on trucks with our guys and helped field teams with some of the storm damage, holding ladders, getting gear off trucks, that sort of thing. Helped unpack deliveries, moving goods around, picking up things from different locations and carting them around. And you can see here we've got a couple of role descriptions on the screen there. We're producing those to get an idea so we can give those out on the day. And so the volunteers got a very clear understanding of what is involved and what are the prerequisites, so fitness, that sort of thing, for each of the different types of roles in a major event. We really noticed the community feedback was very positive. You can see there a screenshot from Facebook again. Some of the really good outcomes from this were just that there was no sort of negative feedback from the community like we sometimes get in these events so close to Christmas time. Everyone's really happy, had a lot of return volunteers who came back multiple days, and we had the local politicians involved, and they ran a thank you barbecue following the event. We've had a movie night as well, and we did an exit survey of all the spontaneous volunteers that came down, and overall very positive. About 95% would recommend to family and friends. We only got sort of a couple bits of feedback, and that was about wanting to know a bit more communication at when they could come down and help or what tasks they could help with. So we've taken all that feedback on board for next time and how we do it differently in the future. A lot of the research about spontaneous volunteering talks about different motivations for volunteering, and this is only anecdotal evidence for what we have here, but I thought it'd be interesting to share what we thought as a team were some of the reasons and motivations for volunteering during this event. Given it was so close to Christmas time, we sort of thought that parents bringing their kids down to volunteer, a lot of children were there, we had lots of them under sort of 18 and many much younger, but we sort of suspected that that was the parents instilling that spirit of community and volunteerism within their children. They might have helped out of the soup kitchen back in the day at Christmas time, and this is what their sort of the new modern soup kitchen is, volunteering with the SES during a time of need. We also notice that more and more communities are becoming more isolated. People are using social media and not getting outdoors and talking to people in real life. So this is an opportunity to make real connection with the community and get involved in a community event. It's also FOMO, or fear of missing out. So people don't want to miss out on a good time or a good experience, and they want to get involved for that. They like to wear the SES branding and get a photo and put on Facebook and get a selfie. So we thought that's really around aligning the SES brand and being part of the cause. We had a few people there looking to get qualifications, so completing their Duke of Edinburgh through their school. And we also thought that people were there to sort of volunteer, try before you buy it, in case they want to sign up with the SES a bit later. This is the real big one for us, is community resilience, and we believe that out of this event, the guys involved, you can see them there, including one of the local councillors from Hornsby Council, they are far more resilient, and if a major event was to happen again, they'd be able to help themselves with their newfound skills being involved in this event, and at least have some realisation of what their local risk is. We believe that everyone's got a role to play in a disaster, not just within the SES, but across the community. People can get involved in this sort of thing if they don't want to be a volunteer with us. But the spontaneous volunteering opportunities are going to be much bigger and greater in the future, we believe. It's also about empowering the local leadership, so empowering the local leaders in that community to get involved and take advantage or take responsibility for their risk. But I found our biggest challenge is balancing that supply with demand. Like what does the community need compared to what do we need to supply them with, and how do we find jobs for volunteers that are suitable? So I'll just wrap up before going to questions. We have mapped our volunteer experience across all categories of volunteering, and I know you can't see that on the screen there very easily, but this is a bit of a map of the life cycle of a spontaneous volunteer currently and how we'd like to improve that in the future. So we're looking at how do we onboard, market to volunteers, give them the best possible spontaneous volunteer experience they want to come back in the future. So rather than trying just to constantly retain people, we're about trying to give them the best experience possible so they want to come back in the future and they want to help their community again, and they have something to show for their time with us. And finally, what's next for us? We're building a community mobilisation framework. So that's that on the right there, which tries to describe how we might utilise the community and work with communities in the future to identify what the supply and demand is and help to match that differently. We're developing a training package to coordinate spontaneous volunteers, so empowering our members on the ground at different volunteer units to be able to manage and coordinate spontaneous volunteers at a local level, scaling sort of up and up as the situation grows. So it's not just my team doing this, but we've got people across the state that can help coordinate spontaneous volunteers regardless of what the incident is. And we really want to enable people to do it themselves. So we've actually just filmed a couple of weeks ago a spontaneous volunteering induction video. And that's something that can be played at a local unit. So if we had people come in and want to get involved, like an airline safety video where we show people how to be safe and how to volunteer with the SES in a spontaneous function. So really it's a bit of an overview of what we're doing at the moment and the Berowra event. Quite an interesting event and a really good team effort that just sprung up to support that community in its time of need. But happy to take on any questions that you might have about that as well.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Lisa, if you want to crank up your microphone again, we've had a great bunch of questions come through. So I'll just swap to this slide popping up just to mark the fact that we're heading into Q&A. So keep popping questions through. I hope I don't miss any. Okay, I'm just going to start off for a couple of questions that people submitted before the webinar, before I get into some of the questions that people have been putting up in the chat box, because it's an issue that always comes up when spontaneous volunteers are talked about, and that is insurance. So I think both of you referred to insurance a little bit, but I've had a few questions about insurance. Just basically any details that you want to share or give about how insurance works and how you made sure that everybody was covered. And specific, I might start with you, Andrew, because there's also a specific question for you about whether and how under 18s were covered for insurance as spontaneous volunteers.
Yep, so we record all the details of our volunteers for insurance purposes. We've met with our insurer, iCare, the government insurance provider. It's self-insurance, so we have to be careful that we aren't putting ourselves up for higher premiums in the future as a result of injuries. But keeping a record and doing that health declaration helps to minimise that sort of risk happening. We do have some minor injuries on the day, people hurting their fingers and that sort of thing while sandbagging, but no insurance claims. But as a volunteer with the SES, regardless of what category a volunteer is, they're covered by insurance, provided they're helping out prior to or during a disaster. They are covered because it's part of the SES work, WHS and Bushfires Act. So they're covered by insurance. Sorry, the second question, Blythe, I just slipped my mind.
Was just insurance.
Oh, yes, so regardless of age, volunteers are covered, but we are obviously quite careful with people who are under the age of 18. We do find suitable tasks for people, and that is including age as well. So we had a person turn up at the event in Berowra wearing thongs who wanted to sandbag. So rather than say no, had to have clothes and shoes, we just put the guy into an area where he wasn't shoveling sand, he was just moving sandbags around and putting them onto trucks. So we do have to be careful and find suitable tasks for people, and same with children. So children are covered for insurance, but we need to find tasks that are suitable for them, and that includes keeping them with their parents, keeping them in a supervised area where they can work clearly in the open view of the SES and others, not going to get taken away into houses or anything like that. So they are covered by insurance, but of course we minimise the risk of anything happening to them or anyone else above the age of 18 as well.
That's great, thanks. And just as an add-on to that, Michelle was just asking, are there any issues with working with children?
No, same for police checks. We don't do police checks given the time, and it would be the same for working with children's checks. So what we do, and we did in Berowra, is minimise the risk by having them in an open location, having them directly there with their parent or guardian. So if something was to happen, we just avoid any issue by having them there with their parent, school teacher, that sort of thing. So they aren't at any risk by going off with any strangers or in the direct supervision of us. Their parents or guardian are always there with them, working with under 18-year-olds.
Okay, great. Thank you. Lisa, did you have anything that you wanted to add about insurance?
Yeah, we were in a slightly different situation. We were taken a bit more by surprise, and so what the protocols for EV crew are that you have an MOU with the local council to say that the local council cover all insurances. Because the event happened so suddenly and Huonville Council got overwhelmed quite quickly, We did not have an MOU in place, so I can tell you what we did, and it wasn't ideal. What we did was I called my board, the chair of my board, and said, listen, we're at risk here. If we go down, I've got a verbal commitment by the Huon Valley Council that they're going to cover insurance, but we don't have an MOU in place. Am I still good to go? And we agreed that the risk was worth taking in this case. What happened was that it was over a long weekend, and the state didn't declare the bushfires as a disaster until after the long weekend. So we had a period of 3 or 4 days where we were working in that situation. And then once the disaster was declared, it was all covered, all volunteers were covered under our state emergency legislation. It's not an ideal way to work, but in our situation, we actually felt comfortable bearing that risk for the period of time. And we also felt that Huon Valley Council were on board with that and would have borne that risk as well.
Great, thank you. There's a bit of an extension on that. The questions that came through before the webinar is a bit more broadly just about risk management and how you make sure everybody is safe and that everyone's there for the right reasons. I think there's a little bit of, this is often a question that comes up about spontaneous volunteering as well as are the right people volunteering and how do you make sure that those volunteers are there for the right reason and are doing things that are beneficial for communities. So might maybe ask you, Lisa, first if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so we put in a few things. We also had the registration, as Andrew was talking about, but we put in place a buddy system, so all volunteers had to buddy up with one another. They had identification, which were high-vis jackets and armbands. We didn't have photo identification, and that was one of the learnings from our point of view, and I'd love to talk to Andrew about what software they actually used to make that happen. We ensured that there were site inductions and that there were shift inductions, that the volunteers had the mobile phone numbers of the shift coordinators, that they were very clear on what their tasks were, that only volunteers that were on shift and all the names were there and up on the board were actually on site, and we had the shift coordinators monitoring where people were and the various, there was always a paid staff member in each of the areas that people were actually volunteering in as well. So we felt that there was a strong level of oversight. In terms of people being there for the right reasons, we did have 1 or 2 issues where there was potential for some petty theft and a bit of loitering, but it was very, very minor. We had on-site security at the Huonville Evacuation Centre. There was at least 2 to 3 security guards 24 hours, and they kept an eye out on what was happening around the place. So that also gave us additional sense of security. And I would say that you're always running a risk of why people are there, but you have to balance that with the benefits that you get from having a community mobilise the way that they did, and just being assured that you have some safety precautions in place. We also had a very strong police presence down there, I should say. They were popping in and out all the time, just because of the sheer numbers that we had down there at various times as well.
Great. There's a question there also about if there's coverage for spontaneous volunteers once an emergency's been called in place in every state, Lynn. So I might just quickly respond to that one. There isn't blanket coverage, insurance coverage, but the arrangements are a bit different state to state. There is Good Samaritan coverage for like bystanders in most states. But the insurance goes organisation by organisation, so you have to be associated with or affiliated with an organisation somehow, and that organisation has insurance that covers you. I think, is Andrew or Lisa, is there anything you'd want to add to that broader question?
I'll just say in Tasmania, once the emergency was...
Oh, okay. Lisa, I had a couple of questions for you. I had a question about if there's coverage for spontaneous volunteers once an emergency's been called in place in the
Yes.
state.
So in Tasmania, once the state emergency is declared, then the volunteers were covered under our legislation, but I don't know how that works for other states. Prior to that emergency being declared, it was certainly sitting with either VT or local council. We're currently working with the state government on how we can have a bit more of a coordinated response to that and really dig into what some of the issues might be around insurance, because the last thing we want is that stands in the way of people volunteering, and the state government are broadly supportive of how they can help facilitate that in Tassie.
Great, thank you. And there was a question as well for you, Lisa, just if you wanted to respond to that, how you manage police checks and working with children checks.
Yeah, sure. So initially what we did was if people had working with vulnerable people or police checks, they just recorded the number and we cited the actual, identification. But in a situation that we were in, there were a number of people who did not have working with vulnerable people checks. The Tasmanian government, through their Department of Justice website, what they have is a statutory declaration. So in Tassie, if you have applied for a working with vulnerable people check, but it hasn't come through yet, then you can sign this stat dec that says, look, I've applied and I meet all these criteria, and then it has to be signed off by the appropriate person. We adjusted that slightly and we just took out that they'd applied for the working with vulnerable people check, but they could comply, and we made sure that they were very clear that they could comply with all of the other requirements of the working with vulnerable people check, and that was done at induction in a short interview, and then they signed off on that, and we had a council member sign off on that as well, and that was enough to satisfy us. What I would say, and it's not that it's necessarily good practice, but again, once a state emergency is declared, there's actually an exemption around the working with vulnerable people check in these situations. It's always good practice to have either those or police checks in place, so we just use best endeavours.
Great, thank you. Andrew, do you know if there's a similar system in place in New South Wales or if it's different there?
So in New South Wales, we have the Workers' Compensation Bushfire Emergency and Rescue Services Act 1987. Without being a lawyer, though, I'm not too sure of the insurance, I guess, what it includes, what doesn't include. But certainly our advice that we've been given is that sort of everyone's covered as long as they include, as long as they meet the requirements in terms of helping in an event, in an emergency, and that covers, it's quite broad from what we understand. And then in terms of police checks, as I mentioned before, we don't really do the police checks, and we believe that it's not required for the work that we do, is provided we supervise them in quite closely the whole time.
Yep, that's great. While I've got you, Andrew, I had another question for you. Just a query about, after people have spontaneously volunteered, was there any increase in the number of people that signed up to be part of SES as a result?
Yes, there has been, and broadly this happens quite regularly. We have these major events, we see an increase in volunteer numbers. In the weeks following the storm in about, I think it was 2016, with this major East Coast low that hit New South Wales, we had about 600 applications in the, sort of the weekend following that, so huge numbers of volunteers interested. After this event, we haven't seen the same numbers. We are looking a bit different in terms of how we can attract people to become part of the SES. So Lynn and Katie, who are on this teleconference at the moment, are working on a project now with the Berowra community to look at how do we involve those community members, not in a sort of a lockdown volunteering way that they might traditionally do, they turn up regularly, but they're given the basic skills, we bring them in, provide them with the sort of the skills to help out in a storm, with working at heights, tarping roofs, that sort of thing. And they'll be volunteers to help out with the remaining jobs that keep trickling in. As you can probably imagine, there's a whole community up there of about 1,500 houses that still have damage, still have tarpaulins. Every bit of wind or rain that comes now results in more jobs, and the volunteers in that area are getting pretty tired. So it's hard to call for spontaneous volunteers to do that sort of technical work, but certainly those volunteers based in the Berowra community who've expressed an interest to turn up regularly and give them a bit more training and make them, I guess, less spontaneous to help out with that more technical work, hoping that they might stay on and become volunteers for much longer. But again, it's about providing the best possible volunteer experience, and we recognise that not everyone wants to stick around and help us, but if we provide a good experience, they might turn up again and again and again in major events, or they might turn up and be a volunteer as a unit member, which is another good option. So we're not trying to lock people down to doing that sort of stuff regularly, but providing a good experience they want to come back on their own motivation.
That's great, thank you. I'll throw back to you, Lisa. I've had a couple of questions come through the chat box and before the webinar about signing people up and registering people. So Saskia was asking about the database for volunteers and what kind of information is requested at the time that you sign people up and put them on the database. And then another question that's directly related to that we got before the webinar was, do you sign people up on the spot, or do they register their interest beforehand and go onto a database? If you wanted to respond to those, Lisa.
Yeah, great. They're really good questions. With EV Crew, that's your basic details. We do ask whether you've got police checks, working with vulnerable people checks, and we ask if there's certain skills that you may possess in terms of, first aid or food handling, those sorts of types of skills. And we want to make that list a lot more comprehensive. One of the learnings, so what I would say is that prior to the event in Tasmania in January, we had 800 people on that database. Afterwards, we had 1,200. What we would like to do is be able to use that database in a better way. And we think we need a bit more information from people, and then to provide training for people on the database to keep them engaged, to also ensure that other organisations know that that database is in existence and can be used. So that's actually another aspect of the learnings for us, and we're actually working with other organisations now about how they might be able to actually access the EV Crew people. In terms of the sign-up, what happened at Huonville is it was very manual. We had manual registration forms and then sign-in login books. Then we converted those to Excel spreadsheets on the overnight shifts to give them something nice and entertaining to do. What we would prefer to do going forward is to actually use the EV Crew database for all of the logistics and the actual keeping of the data. One of the issues you have, though, in emergency events like this is that often you don't have access to the internet or to the technology that you would like to have in the level that you would like to have it, and you may not have the skills and experience in your volunteers to be able to hook into a database or the back end of a database that might be quite complex. So the EV Crew database is Salesforce, and it can be a bit unwieldy. So we're still working through how we might be able to integrate the actual database with the needs on the ground of spontaneous volunteering. That was a very long answer, sorry.
No, that's good. And I guess the volunteers that you put through to help with the evacuation centre, they were people who approached you after the event occurred mostly, so they weren't previously signed up.
No, so when we arrived on Friday night, there were pieces of paper everywhere on the front desk and people's names and phone number written down. And we spent a couple of days going through and calling people and actually getting them onto some sort of Excel spreadsheet. And then we found out what skills and experience they had, their suitability for the different roles that we had, their availability, and then we were able to roster them. So it was a very manual process. But in the end, it worked well for what we needed down there.
Yep, that's great. Just before I ask a couple more questions, I'll just let people know we're going to run out of time to get through everybody's questions, sorry. But what I will do is I've got them all written down, and the ones that we don't get to, I will put to Lisa and Andrew by email and get written responses back to you to make sure that we've kind of ticked off everybody's questions. So if you have other questions still, you can put them into the chat box, or I'll give you an email address at the end as well, just so we make sure that we don't overlook any. I thought this was an interesting question. Again, this one for you, Lisa. What enabled Volunteering Tasmania to be able to respond so quickly? So what did you have in place beforehand, or what did you do that made that possible?
That's a very good question. Basically, we couldn't not respond. So we had in place, of course, we knew how to put in place the inductions, the PDs, being able to understand what was required for the for volunteering itself. So we were well placed there. I have some expertise in the organisation around emergency management in Sarah Martin, who is our EV crew coordinator. So she did up all the policies, PDs, and the infrastructure that we required. At the end of the day, though, we just got down there and dug in, and it was myself doing the logistics on the front desk and seeing what Huon Valley Council needed, and it was my deputy, who is just the most amazing comms and marketing person, who just jumped in and spent the entire week on the comms and with the government and with the Huon Valley, the entire week on the comms and with the government and with the Huon Valley Council getting messages out more publicly. So at the end of the day, I guess we were well prepared in that we understood volunteering and the requirements around it, but then it was just digging in and working with the council on what they needed from us and being able to put the support in around what they needed. I can't emphasise enough that Huon Valley Council were just phenomenal in this piece, as were the Tasmanian government. But Huon Valley led what they needed, and we just responded to that.
I've only got time now to pass one more question on, and this is to both of you, from Kelly. It's a good question to finish up with. Is from thinking back on your different experiences, what would you do differently next time? I might throw to you first, Andrew.
Oh, that is a tough question. I think we've learned a lot, and we actually did a big debrief after this event and have picked out a number of different things, actually pages and pages of work. The big one for us is, I guess, having the systems in place so we can empower our volunteers at all levels of the organisation to manage these spontaneous volunteer events when they happen. So, and we're working now with that training package I mentioned earlier, the community mobilisation framework, the induction video, having all these resources ready to go, so next time it just happens and it happens naturally without relying on people like myself and my team to do this. So it's just a natural thing, and it's well accepted by our service. So that's something we're working on. But I think probably one of the things I would have done differently next time is looking at how do we manage and balance supply and demand. And I mentioned that in the presentation. It's one of the hardest things to do when you have such a changing situation where more jobs are coming in, and you're working with the community and an unknown number of people turning up to volunteer. So it's about, I don't know the answer to that yet, the perfect answer, but it's about managing supply and demand and matching skilled resources with the jobs required. So it's a challenge to work on, and a challenge we'll continue to evolve over time. We'll get better and better at it.
Great, thank you. Lisa, did you want to speak to that one as well?
I would completely endorse Andrew's comments around supply and demand, and also around being able to build capability and capacity a little bit more strongly prior, both with the council and internally. It was a very heavily resource burden on VT, what happened. But if I were to talk about it in terms of what I'd do with the volunteers, is an immediate debrief. We had quite a lot of psychological safety stuff around the volunteers, but we didn't give them that opportunity with a one-on-one debrief afterwards or during their shifts. And I think that that's an important piece that we would like to build in.
Thanks. I did have one other question that does relate to that from Sandra around, so the event that you responded to, Lisa, was quite close to Hobart, and she wondered if that was one of the reasons that there was people available, and was also wondering if there was an event in a more isolated area or an area that had a predominantly elderly population, would there be a shortage of supply of volunteers to assist in places like that?
Look, it's a really good question. Both Bothwell and Queenstown were impacted. They're both much more isolated than Huon Valley, and they both were able to get the volunteers required to support them. We reached out to them on several occasions just to check in and make sure they were still okay, and they were. With the Huon Valley event, I think being close to Hobart was important. It allowed us to draw on a wider range of skills, such as people who had worked with animals, such as people who were in personal support. But the bulk of those volunteers did come from the immediate vicinity. And many of those volunteers, and this is the piece around the psychological support, were actually also called away to evacuate when they thought that they weren't in danger, and then suddenly the fire front shifted, and so they had to be called off and go and actually evacuate themselves. So it was a very, very local response.
I'll have to wrap it up there because we've gone a little bit over time. But as I said, I will go keep track of the questions that were asked and not answered in the webinar, and I'll put them to Lisa and Andrew later. I'll share a recording of the webinar by email and through the EVN network, and copies of slides will be available as well. I'll just flick. If you have, oops, I don't get the slide working, there you go. If you have any questions following up from this webinar, you can contact me on that email address and I will follow up and get any resources through to you. I'll talk to the presenters about any resources they have around this stuff that they can share too, because I've had a couple of questions about accessing resources. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Huge thank you to Lisa and Andrew. I think we could have kept going for quite a lot longer because there's been a bunch of great questions come through that we haven't got to. Yeah, but fantastic presentations. Lots of messages coming through that people have really appreciated it. So you've been very generous with your time and we really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.